Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malignant Young Park died inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Oh, a king Makai begun. It is me. So, yes. I have the rounds. Had to fix a piece. I have the rounds, man, what is it? 3, 6, 7. Between Shakhriyar Mamedyarov versus Wesley. So of course, for all my people in the Philippines, I would say mabuhay hi to you. Magandang umaga, magandang apon, magandang araw. It is afternoon, not quite evening here, so magandang apon works. Masaya ko makita kang muli. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Anybody who is coming from Azerbaijan, I will say salam to you and chak sagol. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. If you guys are ready to go, this was a really interesting game. A really up and down type of situation. So let's go ahead and take a look, see what we have for this guy. D4, knight comes to F6, we have C4, E6, knight to F3, we got D5, knight comes to C3, we got pawn takes C4. So we have the Queen's Gambit declined, and it is the 3 knights Vienna variation. So you know this capture here makes it the Vienna. So it's kind of similar to like a Queen's Gambit accepted, because now you are able to push E4. You know, of course it's not possible before, because, you know, the pawn's just going to take and, you know, you don't really have anything to show for it. We have bishop to b4, so kind of like throwing some Nimzo, Rogozins, let's say Nimzo type situations going. Bishop comes to g5. We see h6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and then we do finally get our pawn back with bishop takes c4. We see c5. You guys know it's coming. It's trying to just break down this structure because, as you can see, white just has a really, really nice pawn center. So we don't want to allow that to survive. So we have e5 getting a nice little tempo on the queen. We got queen back to d8, castles by white, pawn takes d4, and then we do have knight to e4, just getting the knight away from the bishop. And, you know, it wasn't pinned anymore after the king castled, so you're good to go. But, I mean, there's also an alternate variation. You can go knight takes d4, and then after castles, you got a3. And this is actually just like slightly better. You know, you're not too worried about, you know, this and this occurring. But like I said, we do see knight to e4. We have castles by black. Queen comes to e2. We got bishop back to e7. Rook f to d1. You know, even though you are kind of, you know, going through a pawn to do it, I mean, putting the rook opposite the queen, you know, it's always a good thing to do. So we do have queen down to a5. We got a3. You guys know b4 is going to be coming. I mean, just trying to kick this queen away because it's not welcome. Rook over to d8. We see b4 knocking the queen. Queen comes to b6. We see knight down to g3. And, you know, we're clearing like a e4 or maybe a d3 for the queen type situation. You never know what might could come up. So we have bishop to d7, and this allows the rook to take on d4. So after bishop to c6, you know, we have to kind of figure out, like, what are we going to do with the rook? Are we going to trade on d8? Are we going to move it somewhere? And bishop to c6 is actually the novelty of the game as well. So it kind of has like a, you know, a French Rubinstein Fort Knox type of situation to it. You know, just putting the bishop on a nice diagonal. A lot of the times when you have like an e6 situation played, this bishop can become kind of an issue. For those of you that play the French defense, I mean, I'm sure you know what I mean. So we do actually see rook to g4. You know, it's always nice putting the rook across the king as well. So, you know, we're kind of taking advantage of, you know, the king's position a little bit. So bishop takes f3, queen takes f3. We see knight to c6, and this actually allows a really nice move by white, which is knight to h5. And, you know, this is just smooth. I mean, you have this really, really huge pressure built up on this pawn. And there's not really the greatest way to try to defend because you already have h6 pushed. And you also kind of have an issue with this this pawn kind of holding, you know, holding down this, you know, this f6 or f5 push. So it's not the easiest. So we have g5. Knight comes to f6 with check. We see king to g7. Queen comes to f4. And this is a very interesting move. You know, you kind of had a little bit of an issue with this pawn here. So, you know, queen to f4 does take care of that. I mean, there was also rook to e1s coming. you are not worried about knight taking e5. It might kind of seem like, hey, man, if I take right here and then the queen takes, the bishop takes, I mean, this is really nasty, right? But see, the thing about it is the queen doesn't have to take on e5, and there's actually an alternate route that the queen can go. If you do take knight takes e5, you actually have the ability to play knight to h5 with check. And this sets up like the probably the craziest type of combination that you have probably seen. It doesn't. You don't have to go this way, but I mean, if you did so happen to go this way, where the king came down to g6 to try to attack this undefended knight, you would be having queen taking e5, king taking h5, and then actually queen to g7. And it's kind of weird because you're thinking like, well, what about my rook? Like, I mean, you're just gonna desert the rook? Yes, because this is literally mating. If you do take the rook on g4, queen takes f7, and you have a major problem with queen coming to f3 and putting this king in a box. And so, you know, moving the king over. So you're worried about queen to f3, king being forced over here, g3, king being forced down here, and then bishop to f1. And so this is like a crazy amount of calculation that would have to go into that. So bishop to f6 is actually what you'd have to throw in the way, but it wouldn't matter because the queen is still on that path to getting to f3. So, like I said, we do have queen to f4, and we actually have rook over to h8. You know, we see h4. So as you guys can see, I mean, this pressure on this king side for white is insane. You know, you're going to be at some point taking on g5 with the rook or with the pawn, stuff like that. This king doesn't have a lot of space to go. It really just has f8 to go to. So it doesn't have like a whole list of options it can go to. So this is actually really, really nice for white. We see rook 8 to d8, pawn takes g5, and we see h5. Now, backing up, you guys remember me talking all the time about when you're having like opposite side castling, when you're having those attacks with the pawns, you know, usually your opponent's going to be trying to rip your position open. So the thing that you want to try to do is keep it closed as much as possible. And, you know, so you have, of course, you have two options in this position. You can take with the pawn, but I mean, this is literally going to be mating after something like this. The king is going to be forced there, and that's mate. So we can't do that. So on top of the fact that you can't do it, you know, h5 is definitely the best move to make because it does kind of make the pawn be in your way. So we see rook over to h4. We see rook to d4. And this is kind of, you know, a little bit annoying to the queen, but we do see rook, queen to h2. Rook takes on h4, queen takes on h4, and we see queen to d4. And black really, really wants to trade queens because there is just too many threats with this queen on the board. So we do take on d4 with the queen. Knight takes d4, rook over to d1, and then we have rook to d8. And we have reached a point in the game that if you do want to pause the video and guess, there are two like really only moves for white to play in this position to make sure that they hold any type of advantage. If you want to go ahead and stop the video and guess and see what either one of those two are, go ahead and do so. Okay, so for those of you that are very like tactically aware and observant, you guys will actually see that there is an actual check on f3. And the king in its current position is actually subject because now you actually have a discovery that you can place against this rook. So you actually only have two legitimate moves that you can make. There's three moves, but I mean, one of them kind of gives equality to black. The other two probably a little harder to find. And the move is actually, the best one is king to f1, but there is also king to h1. And all you're really doing with either of those two moves is you're sidestepping this check. You definitely don't want to go king to h2 because then there's still that check. And you're going to be winning this rook after you take back this knight. And so, you know, you definitely don't want to drop that. So you have to get your king a little bit safer. You have to notice the threat with rook to d8. So what Shaq actually does recognize it, and he goes king to f1. So if you guess king to f1, you got some pretty nice deep calculation abilities. And we see h4. We got f4, and this is just giving the king a lot more room to breathe and move up and stuff like that. We see h5, and h5 is a really, really nice move because, you know, white has a pretty nice pawn structure over here, so you do want to kind of damage it a little bit. So this is definitely a nice, you know, kind of counterattack move for Wesley. So pawn takes a5, bishop takes a3. We see rook over to b1. Rook comes to c8, you know, throwing a counterattack on this pawn. We see bishop back to d3. And then we see rook down to c1 with check. And you have two different ways that you can really deal with this. You can either just move the king, which Shaq does, or you can just immediately take the rook here and allow this. And, you know, you're kind of steering it, you know, into like drawn waters. The fact that white was in really bad, I mean, the fact that black was in really bad positions and stuff like that, like, you know, white definitely doesn't mind getting away with a draw in this one. We see king up to f2. Rook takes b1, bishop takes b1. We see knight up to c6, and that pawn is pretty much gone. We see king to f3, knight takes a5, king comes to g4. We see b5, king takes h4, b4, knight up to e8 with check. King comes back to f8. We see knight to d6, b3. So, you know, as you guys can see, this pawn is getting pretty far. I mean, this knight at some point is probably going to put himself in a position where this bishop might have to, like, you know, sacrifice itself. Many different options that you have. We got g6, just breaking up black's pawn structure a little bit. Pawn takes g6, we see king to g5. Bishop takes d6, pawn takes d6, knight comes to c4. We see d7, and you know that pawn's not going anywhere, but it was better than having it just get taken on d6. So it forces the king to deal with it. We see king to e7. King takes g6, we see knight down to e3. And we see g3, b2. Knight, king comes to h5. We see king takes on d7. We got g4. I mean, now we might have some ideas of trying to run this pawn up the board a little bit. So the king comes to e7, making sure that it's holding down the king side pawns here. We got king to g5, king to f7. We got f5, pawn takes f5, pawn takes f5. We see knight takes f5. And you do this because, I mean, you know, black doesn't have the ability to ever queen their pawn without you taking it. So, I mean, you're good to go. So the bishop takes on f5. We see b1 equals queen. And then we see bishop takes b1. And you guys can see that this is completely drawn material. Something I want to point out, if you did earlier in the game after king to g6, there was like, you know, there's so many different ways to draw the position. But an alternate way would actually be knight down to d2. You're just kind of pressing the issue with this bishop. So you would actually see f5, pawn takes f5, bishop takes f5, you know, just b2, g4, b1 equals queen, and you, like I said, can give up your bishop. Knight takes, you got g5, king takes d7. And the very interesting thing about this position is the knight is going to be able to perfectly jump to prevent the queening of this pawn in perfect time. King would come to f7, opposing the other king. King to g3, or knight to g3, g6, knight to d5, g7, knight to e5, and this is like I said, you had to be able to calculate that this knight was going to do this right here and then get to that square. After this is drawn. Now, there was a little bit of a chance for white in this position. Let me get back to where I was at in the game. After queen came to f4, and then we see rook to h8, this actually gives, you know, white the ability to kind of kick black around a little bit and bring one more piece into the attack of white. It actually allows b5 to come, and this was like one of the key moves that Shaq missed. You know, you're just trying to knock this knight to a less, you know, a worse square, and you are redirecting this bishop into a nicer area. So after b5, knight would come to a5 probably, then bishop down to e2. And as you guys can see, now you kind of have the ability to move this knight down here, and the bishop kind of has the ability to you know, maintain the knight over there. So it just brings another piece into the action. After rook a to d8, you got h4. And yes, you're breaking down the position of pretty much the same as before, but you don't have as much kind of stopping you in this scenario. So this is actually really, really nice for white. And it's kind of like forced winning. So, you know, Wesley So got lucky another time. You know, he didn't get, you know, he's had some pretty big scares in this tournament. He's definitely gotten to some bad positions, and he's managed to come back and draw the games. So, I mean, that's good. Of course, you know, you don't always like a draw, but I mean, you would much rather draw than lose the game. So, you know, that kind of keeps Wesley So in the fight. So, they are in the process now of playing round 8, and that is Wesley So versus Hikaru Nakamura. So, I'm going to go ahead and get rolling on that game. I have everything pretty much done for the games, the thumbnails and everything made up. So, I just have to wait for the games to get over so I can post them up. So, trying to be the first one to post these games. So, I'm going to get this rolling, and I will see you guys next time. Makito Tayo Mamaya, Aking Makai Bigan, and Pa Alam, and I will see you guys next time.